As the songs of awakening rang through, the world was created. The silence was broken.
Middle-earth, with its rolling hills, broken mountains, flowing rivers, and beautiful forest, was created.
Cellar Door is a journey into the mythology, the mystery, and the beauty of Middle-earth. Sit back.
Close your eyes.
And imagine.
Welcome everybody to Cellar Door, a collaborative project created by Man Bites Media in partnership with Diversely Geek.
The creators, us, being longtime fans, had indulged in hundreds of lore-based dialogues, so we decided to produce a scholastic podcast series that focuses on the lore and history of the Lord of the Ring mythos and the J.R.R Tolkien mythology.
The series is a literacy project encouraging engagement in reading, writing, inclusivity, and communal education. And of course, we're going to be, as our first episode, we want to discuss why we love J.R.R Tolkien's mythologies and why we really do appreciate everything that he did for us. So, of course, Neisha, and I want to let her go first on this one.
So, this is Neisha Mulchan from Diversely Geek, and the mythology and the lore of Tolkien goes beyond the two dimensions of what it means to just pick up and read a book. There is so much archaeology, there's so much culture, there's so much social history, there's so much relevance to us as human beings in understanding our place in the universe and how Tolkien's philosophy of creationism, as he creates it in the Silmarillion, what the possibilities are when we see the mythos of the gods and of Arthar and of Middle-earth, and there's just so much possibility built into his creationism. And for me, as a child, I always felt very connected to those possibilities. And still to this day, I'm connected to it, which is why we always have these huge dialogues.
Yes, we do.
And we just completely just, at the snap of a finger, we're like right into it.
Yes, we do. Hours of dialogue, I'll tell you. Hours and hours of dialogue we've had. But when was the first time that you were introduced to Tolkien's mythology initially? And how did you receive it?
I would say probably at age 9. My uncles are avid readers, and luckily for me, I am the youngest in a family of hundreds. So yes, I know that sounds crazy, but it is actually the truth. And my uncle was a very strong, avid follower of mythology, whether it was the Greek gods or the Roman mythologies, etc. And so very easy for him in the 60s to be able to pick up the Lord of the Rings trilogy, but then to also, luckily for me, pick up the Silmarillion as well. And I read everything everyone read. Yeah. So I had access to it. And it was also very interesting that coming from the culture I'm from, which is a West Indian, very Asian, New York background, normally an elder uncle, 20-something years old, would not have shared that with a child like me, a young female.
Yeah.
But, there were no predispositions in terms of gender identity, so for me, I was easily acculturated into the Tolkien philosophy because it was okay to have that kind of conversation with me.
Which that's very much in tune with what Tolkien supported, and the kind of ethos that he created from the get-go was very open and kind of like, let's all just have this discussion and have an open dialogue, not just amongst adults, but children as well. Thus his writing of The Hobbit and everything else that he did. For me, honestly, personally, the first connection that I had was my father. My father was, like your uncle, was a very avid reader, and especially of mythologies, and Lord of the Rings was the crowning achievement for him. This was the book that sat at the top of the bookshelf and was the goal. He brought me on to read very much like the literature classics and all that stuff, the Jules Verne novels and everything as such, and from there I was building my way up the bookshelf to going into the history of a lot of history books and a lot of other mythologies like the Greek myths and the Roman mythologies. And then from there he handed me Lord of the Rings, which that was like the ultimate achievement. It was the final acceptance, like saying, yes, you know what you're reading now, and you could actually digest something as intense as Lord of the Rings. Because he had read The Hobbit to me as a child. And
right, I can see that.
Yeah. And then also he had actually shown me the movies, the animated movies, which we had stumbled across in these like kind of what they would call now hipster stores, but back in the early 90s. So I was about 6 years old when I got introduced to the animated series, the animated movies, and that just blew my mind. It opened the floodgate for all these different things and this world of fantasy which I had never touched, and that changed my outlook on life completely once I read the book.
Fantasy, mythology, and spiritual tradition, because growing up in the spiritual tradition that I did, it was extremely there was a perfect flow for me. There was the fluidity, that's the word. It was pure fluidity to me to be able to accept what he was writing in the same way that you're talking about. So. And
it's just beautifully written. It's something that the Lord of the Rings novels are just, it's kind of like this very flowery language that is done in a way that exemplifies the world that he created. Every use of a word is used on purpose. There is something that he created with every single movement and the choices that he did in each and every word. It created that world even further for me. And this is a book that I read within the first year. I read it twice because I loved it that much.
Which one, the Silmarillion?
No, this was the Lord of the Rings.
Okay. I just wanted to be sure because that's so much to digest. So
no, Lord of the Rings I read twice straight through. I didn't tackle any of the history of Middle Earth or the Silmarillion until a few years later in a late middle school, high school era. And that's when I really delved deep into the mythology. Within a year and a half, I had read the Silmarillion from cover to cover and all the History of Middle Earth books, which all in all is almost 12 books at that time. And since then, I've read every book that's come out since then, as soon as it's been released. But it's something that's it's become a huge portion of my life, and that's why Neisha and I have very long conversations about many different fandoms, but Lord of the Rings is the one that we turn to every time, and we always fall back into either Doctor Who or Lord of the Rings. And then we had to make this decision to make this program and go into something different, not just the films. The films have been tackled enough, I think, and we want to go into the deeper part of the story, the mythology, where the creation started, how it started, how Tolkien imagined the creation of all things, how Tolkien imagined the creation of all these different races that have captured our imaginations for almost 90 years now, closing on 100 years almost now. And it's incredible that after 90 years, this legacy is not just there and thriving, but it's becoming even more bolsterous, and we're seeing even further development of the stories of Tolkien every year. And I just really love to be able to present, the both of us be able to present this to everyone, including yourselves that are listening to this podcast, for those of you that know the mythology, or those of you that are first times listening into a mythology of Tolkien and everything that's involved.
I'm listening to you. Thank you. And as always, when I'm thinking about Tolkien and the cultures and the philosophies and the ecology of Tolkien, I'm looking at it from an extremely personally spiritual, transformative perspective. The fact that one of the things you and I discuss very often is that Tolkien uses neurolinguistics to be able to transform what we create, what we consider to be a perspective or a point of view, into something that's it's almost cuboidal or diagrammatic. What I mean by that is it becomes transformed into this crystal that has multiple prisms of points of view that allow us to be able to see multidimensionally. And when he's creating the culture of beauty, the Lothlorians, for instance, yes, you're no longer, you are transformed. It's you're mesmerized, because what he is giving us is a perspective of creationism and existence, where we get to suspend our disbelief based on the harshness of reality, because he'd gone through that. He lived through loss, personal loss, the loss that he'd faced through war, which of course sparked a lot of the anthologic and the apocalyptic, elements of his writing and the story that we see in the battles of Middle-earth later on. But we're looking at a beauty that's personally and spiritually transformative in terms of allowing us to be part of the element, to find our place in that creationism, and know that there, like I said, as we spoke recently, there are no labels in his creationism. What is. So there's a form of, there's genderlessness or gender fluidity. There's colorlessness or all color. There's racial integration simply because it is, not because anyone has to. While we are facing the throes of evil versus good, because that is exactly in the long run what we're dealing with. It's so much more intricate and complex, but at the same time, labels aren't necessary. And
the social issues that were tackled in the 1930s, between the 1930s and 1950s, because let's be real, it was not just written within a 10-year time span, but Tolkien's, the way that he wrote these stories and this mythology, he wrote it with very much a look into a very pessimistic, optimistic look into the future of, this is how society should be. This is how I want my society to be. And he implanted that throughout his books. There's a lot of acceptance in all his books. And not only acceptance, but there is beauty, is an appreciation of nature, which is very apparent throughout all the novels and all the stories that he creates and writes. He has this immense appreciation and respect for nature that is lost nowadays because of technology, because of industry, and this is very apparent.
But that's perfectly represented as you're referencing. It's purposefully or perfectly well represented in the juxtaposition of Melkor versus Iluvatar and Manwë, and how each of them falls into their place in terms of the lore of the gods. And in Melkor, there's a representation of the darkness that can come from being lost in the quagmire of technology, or of battle, or of
the corruption of
the soul. Right, exactly. Where we're using, because the whole point is Melkor is this amalgamation of greed, of lust, and that goes back to the biblical ties.
Yes.
And then everything else, and arda is a manifestation of purism, of holism.
Yes.
And I say holism because the spiritual reference is about the pure spirit, about the fact that there's equality, and Elevator creates everything in a state of equality.
Yes, he does. And these are the type of dialogues that we want to be bringing to you now in this podcast format. We're giving you a little bit of a snippet of what we want to analyze and how we're going to approach this subject, because it is such a mammoth. Yes, a mammoth of a undertaking to go into. So what we're going to be doing is we're actually going to be presenting it to you from the beginning. What more than from creation onward? We're going to be telling the story that Tolkien told us in his amazing novels, and we're going to start off with the introduction of how everything came to be, and then from there each sequential episode will be going into the different gods per se. And we're going to be starting off with Eru Iluvatar, the one true god. And then we're going to be starting our Ainur series, which will be Manwë in one episode, Melkor, Uma, Ole, Ivana, and Mandos. And we will be doing an episode for each of those, with the exception of Ulmo and Ule, which there is not a lot written on them, not enough to cover within an hour time span. Each episode will be 1 hour long, so please subscribe to the channel, because once we post these episodes, you will start seeing them come up on a regular basis. And also, please go onto our websites, both of ours, diverselygeek.org and manbitesfilm.com, and we will be linking each other's websites on there as well. But on the show notes below, you would actually be able to see a link straight to the show channel itself website. So if you want to check out further content, which we will be posting our YouTube videos and fan interaction. So go ahead and explain a little bit about the fan interaction.
So what we're going to be doing as part of our podcast series, while you're going to be getting the lore and the mythology, we're also going to be having a lead out with answering fan questions. So, for instance, a fan who loves this part of the movies but never really understood how to merge that or blend it well with the lore, because the lore, as we know, was not written chronologically. So we're going to try and help as best as we can with the little knowledge we have to be able to put it back into a chronological state so that the fantasy makes sense. Yeah. So, because it is fantasy after all, and we're going to try and see if we can help people to have it make sense. And then what we're going to be doing as bonuses is with our YouTube channel for Cellar Door, you will have bonus YouTube videos with fan interactions where we're going to be, doing more one-to-one discussions with a group of fans, or it might include one of our panels at one of the conventions that we'll go to, or one of what are planned literary series.
Yes. Which that will be to be announced on the website as well. So if you want further information about our literacy series, you could check it out on the website once we launch this episode, because we should have some dates set in
I would think so
motion by then. And of course, this is with the release of this week coming out, the amazing biopic of Tolkien himself, which we are extremely excited about. So next time you will be hearing our version of what we believe why Tolkien actually undertook this amazing story and how he came to be. Yes. So this is going to be, again, each of these episodes, we want to put this disclaimer on there, because this is what we believe is the correct order to tell these stories in. And again, this is a lot left for interpretation, because Tolkien, again, was creating a mythology, and most of these books were put based on notes that he wrote. So this is not technically all the notes and everything put with 100% authorization.
Right, because we don't have
by
access
Tolkien.
to everything.
Correct.
We're only working off of what we have access to. Research being done through the access to what we can through the Tolkien Society.
Yes,
and the scholarly exhibits that have been approved around the world. So, we're doing our best to try and bring you the most up-to-date expert knowledge that we can, but we want you to also be very, very aware we certainly can make mistakes. Yes.
And this is going to have our little twist to it.
Yeah.
It's going to have our little twist to it, because that's the great thing about novels, and you are able to put your own interpretation in a novel. And where what we see in the novel is going to be completely different than what you see. And that's why we want you to start telling us, where do you see this? Maybe you might have a differing opinion than we do. I want to see that, because that's an amazing conversation, and that's the reason why Neisha and I have had hours of conversation.
Yeah, pretty
because much. There's so many different perspectives that you could see these stories being told in, and see what the meaning could be to you.
And one of the things I want to remind Lewis that we're going to be doing is we're also taking a pan-cultural look at the influence of Tolkien as we tell the lore. So we wanted to definitely be able to bring in a more global approach to the understanding, because here's a mind-blowing concept, friends. We who read the lore in English understand it in English. It was not written in the English that we see it today. It's actually more referential to Old English, more of a Celtic feel to it. But remember that people around the world read it in their own languages, therefore interpret it differently.
Yes.
Which is okay, but it's very mind-blowing to have those kind of conversations with folks.
Well, just to put it in perspective, the fact that these novels have been made into so many different languages, and still to this day hold the world record for the highest, the most copies sold of any fictional novel, besides what they consider fiction is the Holy Bible as well. That's up for interpretation as well, but we'll leave that for another time and another show.
Right. So, okay. I hope that we've given them enough information about what we're going to be presenting through Cellar Door, and I hope that everyone's as excited as we are to be able to really move ahead as we explore the lore, the fantasy, and the mythology, and also, with that pan-cultural and personal perspective. So this is going to be very fun.
Yes. So this is us signing off for this week, and we'll see you guys in 2 weeks.
And in the words of Bilbo Baggins, I think I'm quite ready for another adventure.
Yes, we are.